In 2019, Aiia Maasarwe was 21 years old, a Palestinian-Israeli exchange student who had come to Australia to study and experience life in a new country. She was supposed to be safe here. On the night of January 16th, surveillance cameras captured Aiia stepping off a tram and walking toward the student housing where she lived. This is the last footage of her. She would never make it home, and what happened to her over the next 30 minutes would send shockwaves through the city of Melbourne. Before we go any further into this investigation, I think it's important we talk about who Aiia Maasarwe actually was. Because in stories like this, it's easy to get caught up in the horror of what happened and forget that the victim was a real person with a real life, real dreams, real people who loved her. Aiia was born in 1997 in a small town in northern Israel. She grew up in a close-knit family, mom, dad, 3 sisters. And from everything her family and friends have said about her, Aiia was one of those people who just radiated positivity. Every picture, every memory captured on camera, she was smiling in all of them. That's who she was. Friendly, optimistic, kind. But Aiia wasn't just warm and friendly. She was ambitious, driven. She wanted more than what her small hometown could offer, so she enrolled at Shanghai University in China to pursue a business degree. The plan was to eventually work with her father in his business operations there. She had her whole future mapped out, international career, working alongside her dad, building something meaningful. In 2018, she got an opportunity that was too good to pass up. She was selected for a 5-month exchange program at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia, a chance to study abroad, experience a new culture, add another adventure to what was already shaping up to be an extraordinary life. She arrived in August 2018, excited about everything that lay ahead. Her uncle would later tell reporters that the family had always believed Australia was exceptionally safe. That was part of why they weren't worried about Aiia being so far from home. Australia was supposed to be one of those places where bad things didn't happen, where a young woman could walk home at night without fear. By January 2019, Aiia had been in Melbourne for about 5 months. She'd settled into student accommodation near the La Trobe campus in Bundoora. She'd made friends. She'd started building a life there. On the night of January 15th, she went to a comedy show at the Comics Lounge in North Melbourne with some friends. Just a normal night out, laughing, relaxing, enjoying herself. When the show ended, she said goodbye to her friends and headed home alone. She took a tram toward Bundoora, and somewhere around midnight she video called her sister back in Israel. The two of them talked as Aiia rode the tram, then got off near the corner of Plenty Road and Main Drive, about 50 meters from the stop. Her student accommodation was close, just a short walk away. She never made it. Just minutes after stepping off the tram, on a dark, empty street, she was attacked. At the time of the attack, Aiia was on FaceTime with her younger sister back in Israel, thousands of miles apart, different countries, different time zones, but connected through a screen, talking and laughing the way sisters do. And then her sister heard the phone fall, strange sounds, voices, cars passing. She called Aiia's name, but there was no answer. She kept calling, kept trying to reach her, but there was only silence. The call went dead. She tried messaging, nothing. She tried calling back, nothing. For hours, she had no idea what had happened to her sister. All she had were those sounds, the falling phone, the voices, the terrible silence that followed. Around 7 a.m. that morning, maintenance workers near the Polaris shopping mall in Bundoora made a discovery that would shake the city of Melbourne. In the shrubbery near the parking lot, partially hidden from view, they found the body of a young woman. She had been beaten, she had been sexually assaulted, and in a final act of depravity, her body had been set on fire. The last words she ever spoke were to her attacker. According to court documents, she cursed at him, a final act of defiance against someone who had already decided to destroy her. Even in those terrifying final moments, she fought back the only way she could, with words, with courage. It wasn't enough to save her, but it tells you something about who Aiia Maasarwe was, even at the very end. So that's the woman at the center of this story, a daughter, a sister, a student with dreams and ambitions, and a smile that never seemed to fade. 21 years old with her whole life ahead of her. And now police had the horrific task of finding whoever had taken all of that away. The question was, where do you even start? When investigators arrived at the scene that Wednesday morning, they knew they were dealing with something brutal. The state of Aia's body made that clear, but brutal crimes don't solve themselves. You need evidence, you need leads, you need something to point you in the right direction. Fortunately, this killer had made mistakes, a lot of them. The first break came from the crime scene itself. Within about 100 meters of where Aia's body was found, police recovered items of clothing, a black baseball cap and a gray t-shirt. They appeared to be men's clothing, and investigators immediately suspected they belonged to the attacker. It looked like he'd fled the scene in a hurry, climbing over a fence near the parking lot, dropping his cap on one side, then stripping off his blood-soaked t-shirt and tossing it as he ran. Panic, carelessness, or both. Either way, he was already leaving a trail. There was more. Police found a metal pipe, the weapon used to beat Aiia, and nearby, a container of accelerant that had been used to set her body on fire. The killer hadn't just left behind clothing, he'd left behind the tools of his crime. But here's what really changed the investigation. When forensic teams examined Aia's body, they found something under her fingernails, fragments of skin. Someone else's skin. Aiia had fought back. In those terrible final moments, she had scratched her attacker, clawing at him hard enough to tear away pieces of his flesh. And in doing so, she had given investigators something invaluable: DNA. Police now had biological evidence from multiple sources: the skin under Aia's nails, traces on the baseball cap, on the t-shirt, and from samples collected from her body. If all of these matched a single person, they'd have an airtight case. They just needed to find him. Meanwhile, detectives were pulling every piece of CCTV footage they could get their hands on. Cameras from the tram Aiia had been riding, cameras from nearby businesses, cameras from the Polaris shopping mall. And when they reviewed that footage, something caught their attention. A man, wearing a baseball cap matching the one found at the scene, was captured on camera wandering around the area in the time before the attack. He appeared to be just loitering, walking around with no apparent purpose, no bag, no destination, no reason to be there at that hour. And crucially, he wasn't carrying the metal pipe, which meant he picked it up somewhere along the way. This wasn't someone who came armed and ready. This was someone who found a weapon of opportunity and used it. Detectives also pulled Aia's phone records and went through her messages, her contacts, her social media. They needed to rule out the possibility that she knew her attacker, that this was personal, a targeted attack by someone in her life. But everything came back clean. No threats, no stalkers, no angry ex-boyfriends, no conflicts with anyone. This confirmed what investigators had already suspected. Aiia was a random victim. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nobody had seen the actual attack. Nobody had heard screams. The street was dark and empty when it happened. Aiia had been completely alone, except for her sister, thousands of miles away, listening through a phone that had fallen to the ground. But the CCTV footage and the physical evidence were painting a clearer picture by the hour. And on January 18th, just 2 days after Aia's body was discovered, police made an arrest. They found him in Pioneer Reserve, a park in the nearby suburb of Greensboro. He was sitting in a barbecue area, not hiding, not running, just sitting there. His name was Cody Herman, 20 years old. He didn't resist when officers approached him. The DNA results came back and confirmed what investigators already knew. The skin under Aia's fingernails, Herman. The baseball cap, Herman. The t-shirt, Herman. The samples from Aia's body, Herman. Every single piece of biological evidence pointed to the same person. When questioned, Herman denied any involvement, denied knowing anything about what happened to Aiia. But the evidence was overwhelming, and his denials meant nothing in the face of it. The next day, January 19th, Herman appeared before the Melbourne Magistrates Court. He was formally charged with rape and murder. He didn't apply for bail. He was remanded in custody, where he would stay for the next 9 months while the legal process played out. But here's a detail that makes this story even more chilling. During the investigation, police discovered that Herman was not a complete stranger to the area where Aiia lived. In fact, twice in the 6 weeks before the murder, he had been seen near Aia's student housing complex. On one occasion, he approached students at the building and told them he'd lost his key, trying to get them to let him inside. On another, residents spotted him standing outside on the grass, just watching. At the time, nobody thought much of it, just some guy who seemed a bit lost. But looking back, knowing what we know now, it paints a very different picture. Was he stalking Aiia specifically? Police don't believe so. There's no evidence he knew who she was or had targeted her individually, but he knew that area. He'd been there before. He knew that young women lived there, alone, far from their families. Case closed, right? Well, not quite, because now came the harder questions. Questions that don't have easy answers. Who was Cody Herman? What would make a 20-year-old with no prior criminal record commit such an unspeakably violent act? And when it came time for judgment, what would justice actually look like for a crime this terrible? When you hear about a crime this brutal, this senseless, you expect the perpetrator to be some hardened criminal, someone with a history of violence, someone who'd been on police radar for years, building up to something like this. But Cody Herman? He had no prior convictions, not one, no documented history of violence, no criminal record at all. On paper, there was nothing, absolutely nothing, that would have predicted he was capable of what he did to Aiia Maasarwe. So what happened? How does a 20-year-old with a clean record commit one of the most savage murders Melbourne had seen in years? The answer, as it turns out, is complicated and disturbing, and honestly, kind of heartbreaking in its own way, not because it excuses anything Herman did, but because it shows how completely a person can be destroyed by their circumstances long before they destroy someone else. Let me paint you a picture of Cody Herman's life at the time of the murder. He was living in a condemned house, not an apartment with overdue rent, not a friend's couch, a condemned building, a place deemed unfit for human habitation, where he was essentially squatting because he had nowhere else to go. No stable home, no family support, nothing. He had no job, no income beyond Centrelink benefits. That's Australia's welfare system. And those benefits? They went almost entirely to buying drugs. His daily routine, as his own defense attorney would later describe it in court, consisted of collecting welfare, purchasing drugs, sharing those drugs with acquaintances, and shoplifting food from supermarkets to survive. We're talking about stealing croissants and chocolate milk, basic items. This wasn't someone living on the margins of society. This was someone who had fallen completely through the cracks. Herman had aspirations once. He wanted to be a rapper, performed under the stage name MC Codes. There was some creative spark there, some dream of making something of himself, but the gap between that dream and his reality was so vast it might as well have been a different universe. And that gap bred frustration, resentment, rage. But here's where it gets darker. The real story of Cody Herman doesn't start with drugs or homelessness or failed rap careers. It starts much, much earlier. Herman's childhood was, by any measure, a disaster. He grew up in the foster care system, shuffled between homes, never staying long enough to form real attachments, never belonging anywhere. He was separated from his indigenous heritage and culture, cut off from the roots that might have given him some sense of identity. The people and institutions that were supposed to protect him and raise him failed. A forensic psychiatrist who later evaluated him would call Herman a product of the system. Not of a family, not of a community, of a system. And that system had neglected him, mistreated him, and ultimately abandoned him. The result, according to forensic experts who evaluated him after his arrest, was a severe personality disorder, not a character flaw or a bad attitude, but a genuine psychiatric condition rooted in years of neglect and abuse during his most formative years. The kind of damage that fundamentally rewires a person's brain while it's still developing. The kind that doesn't go away. A forensic psychiatrist named Associate Professor Andrew Carroll examined Herman extensively. His conclusion? That Herman's personality dysfunction and his accumulated unprocessed anger, particularly toward women and toward the world in general, had directly led to what Carroll clinically described as an angry type of sexual homicide. Another expert, neuropsychologist Associate Professor Warwick Brewer, confirmed that Herman's mental functioning was significantly impaired. And yes, there were drugs involved. On the day before the murder, he'd used a significant amount. But here's an important detail. There was no evidence he was in a drug-induced psychosis when he attacked Aiia. The drugs didn't cause what happened. They were just another layer of dysfunction in a life that was already falling apart. When Herman's attorneys asked him why he was so angry, why he carried so much rage inside him, his answer was simple: 5 words that tell you everything and nothing at the same time. He said, "I have everything to be angry about. Now let me be absolutely clear about something. None of this, the trauma, the mental illness, the poverty, the drugs, none of it excuses what Cody Herman did. He made a choice that night. He saw a young woman walking alone, and he chose to attack her, to violate her, to kill her, to set her body on fire. That was his choice, and he alone is responsible for it. But understanding how someone becomes capable of such horror, that matters too, because monsters don't appear out of thin air. They're created, failed by systems that were supposed to help them, ignored until it's too late. And by the time Cody Herman crossed paths with Aiia Maasarwe, he was already a bomb waiting to go off. She just happened to be in the wrong place when he finally exploded. The question now became, what does justice look like for a crime this terrible, committed by someone this broken? October 29, 2019, 9 months after Aia's murder, the Supreme Court of Victoria. Cody Herman had already pleaded guilty to both charges, rape and murder. There was no trial, no jury, no debate about whether he did it. The evidence was overwhelming and he'd admitted everything. The only question left was the sentence. How many years would he spend behind bars? Would he ever see freedom again? The prosecution made their position clear from the start. They wanted life. In their view, the brutality of this crime, the savage beating, the sexual assault of an unconscious victim, the deliberate burning of her body to destroy evidence, warranted the maximum penalty available under Australian law. Nothing less would be adequate. The prosecutor reminded the court of what the forensic pathologist had testified, that Aiia spent her final minutes in severe pain and terror, that she was conscious for part of the attack, conscious enough to fight, to scratch, to scream, and that none of it was enough to stop what was happening to her. Herman's defense attorney, Tim Marsh, faced what might be the most difficult job in criminal law, arguing for leniency for a man who had done something truly monstrous. Marsh didn't try to minimize what his client had done. He called it the ultimate offending and a horrific rape and murder. But he pointed to the psychiatric evaluations, the childhood trauma, the severe personality disorder. He argued that Herman, while absolutely guilty, was less morally culpable than someone who had committed the same crimes without that background of damage. He even suggested that with appropriate treatment during incarceration, Herman had fair prospects of rehabilitation. The prosecution's response to this was blunt. A difficult childhood is not an excuse for rape and murder. Thousands of people survive terrible childhoods without becoming killers. Herman's past might explain his rage, but it doesn't justify what he did with it. During the proceedings, the court learned that Herman had written a letter to Aia's family. In it, he asked for their forgiveness. He wrote that he thought about what he'd done every single day, that he wished he could turn back time. The family refused to read it. Justice Hollingworth described Aiia as a friendly, optimistic, kind young woman who had her whole life ahead of her, and a loving and much-loved member of the Maasarwe family. She acknowledged that Aia's death had profoundly affected her parents and her 3 sisters, leaving an enormous hole in their lives. But the judge also had to consider the mitigating factors. The law required it. She accepted the psychiatric evidence about Herman's severe personality disorder and its direct connection to his childhood trauma. She acknowledged the clear causal link between his impaired mental functioning and his crimes. And she found, and this is the part some people struggled to accept, that Herman was less morally culpable than someone who had committed the same acts without that history of deprivation and damage. Less morally culpable, not innocent, not excused, but less culpable. It's a legal distinction that makes sense in a courtroom but feels almost impossible to accept when you know what happened to Aiia Maasarwe. The judge also noted that Herman had fair prospects of rehabilitation with appropriate treatment and support during his incarceration. Justice Elizabeth Hollingworth sentenced Cody Herman to 36 years in prison, with a non-parole period of 30 years. When the sentence was read, Herman sat motionless. No reaction, no emotion. He stared at the floor as the number, 36 years, hung in the air of the courtroom. 36 years. That's the price Cody Herman will pay. Whether it's enough, I'll leave that for you to decide. Thank you for watching. I'm James. and I'll see you in the next one.